The evening she walked into the Harrington and Associates gala with the small wrapped parcel tucked under her arm. Stella had already rehearsed what she would say at least 40 times. She'd spent the better part of a week deciding on the gift. A hand-bound sketchbook, exactly the kind Kieran used to carry, with a note folded inside that held 8 years of words she had never been able to send. She found him near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Toronto waterfront, laughing at something one of the senior partners had said. He was exactly as she remembered, and nothing like it at the same time. The same dark eyes, the same way of tilting his head when he was amused. But there was something polished and deliberate about him, now that hadn't been there when he was 22, and helping a stubborn 14-year-old untangle algebra at the kitchen table. She took a breath and started toward him. He saw her when she was still a few steps away. Their eyes met for just a moment, and then he smiled the pleasant, unfocused smile of a man greeting a colleague he hasn't quite placed. "Evening," he said, extending his hand. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. Kieran Ashby." The sketchbook felt very heavy under her arm. She shook his hand. It took everything she had to keep her expression calm. "Stella Baird," she said. "I'm on the interior integration team." "Wonderful." He was already glancing past her shoulder. "Glad to have you on board." And that was it. He moved on, and Stella stood there with her useless gift and 8 years of waiting quietly dissolving somewhere in her chest. She thought about her grandmother's house in East Vancouver, the pale blue siding, the cedar hedge, the narrow row of rental rooms along the back fence that Grandma Ruth rented to university students to help cover property taxes. She thought about being 14 years old and watching a young man from Halifax haul 2 duffel bags and a box of drafting supplies through the back gate. For the first time, the late September light catching the dust on his shoulders. She had not expected back then to remember him for the rest of her life. Stella had grown up understanding, in the quiet way children absorb things they are never told directly, that her parents' marriage was built on land that kept shifting. Her father, George, had poured everything into a small contracting business when Stella was 7. For a while it worked. There were school trips and new winter coats and dinners at restaurants on birthdays. Then came a partnership that went wrong, money borrowed and not returned, and the slow unraveling that followed. By the time Stella was 11, her father was working 2 jobs and barely home, and her mother, Penny, had developed a heaviness that no one in the family named out loud for a very long time. Stella did not fully understand depression until she was much older. At the time, she only knew that her mother spent some afternoons in bed with the curtains drawn, that there were prescriptions lined up on the bathroom shelf, that certain conversations made Penny's face go somewhere far away. She knew that it frightened her. She learned to be quiet, to manage her own feelings, to not add to the weight her mother was already carrying. When she was 13, her parents made a decision that felt enormous and ordinary at the same time. Stella would go and live with Grandma Ruth and Grandpa Ed in East Vancouver, while her father tried to stabilize the business and her mother underwent a more intensive course of treatment. It was not a dramatic rupture. There were no tearful goodbyes at train stations. Her father drove her there on a Sunday afternoon, carried her bags inside, held her for a long time at the door, and then got back in the truck. She watched him pull away and told herself she was fine. Ruth and Ed were kind people in the particular Canadian way, not effusive, not performative, but steadily, practically kind. Ruth cooked too much food and pushed plates at people. Ed fixed things without being asked. They didn't press Stella to talk about home. They let her find her footing. The house always smelled of cedar and something baking. And the backyard had a garden that Ed tended with the seriousness of a man with a long-term project. And along the back fence, there was the row of rooms. When Stella arrived, 2 of the 4 rooms were occupied, a nursing student who kept unusual hours and an older PhD candidate who played harmonica very quietly in the evenings. The 3rd room sat empty for most of that autumn. Then in late September, Kieran Ashby arrived from Halifax. He was 22. He was in his 2nd year of architecture school at UBC. He was polite to Ruth and Ed in the specific way of someone who had been raised to be careful about taking up space, always thanking them, always offering to carry things. Within 2 weeks, he had quietly become Ruth's favorite. She started leaving extra servings of dinner outside his door without comment. He started with equal silence, appearing in the garden on Saturday mornings to help Ed with whatever needed doing. Stella watched all of this from a careful distance. She was 14, and she had recently decided, with the authority of someone who has observed enough adult misery, that she wanted nothing to do with love or marriage. She had seen what it did to people. She had no interest. What she had instead was an alarming report card. It was Ruth who brought it up one evening at supper. Stella was struggling in math and science. Not lazy. Ruth was clear about that, but she had missed a good deal of school during the upheaval of the previous 2 years, and she'd fallen behind. Ruth mentioned, without any particular inflection, that Kieran was excellent in both subjects. Stella stared at her bowl of soup. She did not want a tutor. She got one anyway. He came to the kitchen table the first evening with a quiet, businesslike air, looked at her textbooks, looked at her notes, and then looked at her with an expression that was not unkind, but was also not particularly gentle. "You stopped paying attention around Unit 4, he said. "That's fixable." She wanted to argue. She couldn't because he was right. He was not the kind of tutor who made things easy or comfortable. He asked questions and waited, without fidgeting, for her to actually think through this answer before offering help. When she tried to skip steps, he went back to the beginning. When she got something right, genuinely right, not just copied from his explanation, he nodded with a specific, brief satisfaction that she found herself, reluctantly, wanting to earn again. After 3 weeks she had stopped dreading the kitchen table sessions. He brought a battered thermos of tea and always poured one for her too, without asking. He had a habit of leaving small notes in the margins of whatever she was working on. Not corrections, just observations. A question mark here, a small star there, a good instinct written so lightly she almost missed it. She took those notebooks home at the end of each session and read the margin notes twice. She was 14. She knew it was ridiculous. She told herself it was ridiculous. By January, her grades had recovered. By March, she was ahead of most of her class. That spring, he taught her to navigate by map and compass. She had no idea why she agreed to learn, except that he asked as if it was perfectly obvious she would want to know, and somehow that made it obvious. They spent several Saturday mornings walking trails in Pacific Spirit Park, Kieran pointing out landmarks, explaining how to read topography, letting her make mistakes, and then asking what she'd do differently. She never got a bearing wrong once she understood the method. In May, he found her sitting on the back steps after school, not crying but close to it. She had received a letter from her mother, not a bad letter, actually a hopeful one, describing a breakthrough in treatment. But sometimes hope is harder to hold than despair, because it means you have to want something again, and she didn't know if she was ready. She didn't explain any of this. He sat down beside her. He didn't ask what was wrong. He said after a while, "You want to walk?" They walked for 2 hours without talking much about anything in particular. When they got back, she felt lighter. She did not examine why too carefully. That summer was the one she would return to in her mind, later, when she was trying to understand how someone becomes so deeply woven into the fabric of ordinary days that you don't notice how much space they take up until they're gone. He brought her to secondhand bookshops and let her pick anything she wanted. He had a particular fondness for architecture monographs, and she developed one too, leafing through photographs of buildings she had never heard of, while he explained what the architects had been trying to do. He pointed at a slim field notebook on a shelf once and said, "These are the ones I like. You can see them thinking." She bought him one before the end of summer. He laughed when she gave it to him, startled and genuinely pleased, and said she shouldn't have wasted her allowance. He put it in his jacket pocket and she saw him reach for it later that same afternoon, the way you reach for something you've already decided to keep. He had promised her, in a roundabout way, that she could ask him a question at the end of summer, and he would answer it honestly. She had been working up to asking whether he planned to stay in Vancouver after graduation. The answer terrified her. She had decided she needed to know anyway. She never got to ask. The last morning of August, she came out to the backyard at her usual time, and his room was dark. There was a note slipped under the kitchen door, written in the same compressed, precise handwriting as his margin notes, apologizing for leaving without saying goodbye. His sister had been injured in a car accident in Halifax. He had to go that night. He didn't know when he'd be back. He didn't leave a phone number. She checked 3 times to make sure she hadn't missed it. She went to Pacific Spirit Park by herself that morning and walked for 4 hours until her feet hurt, and she had used up all the crying she had in her. Then she went home and told herself, with the particular ferocity of someone who has survived harder things, that she would be fine. 8 years is a long time to be fine. She was, largely. She finished high school with strong grades, chose architecture at Ryerson. She could not have explained why to anyone who asked, though she understood it herself, and moved to Toronto at 22 with 2 suitcases and a loan from her father, who had slowly rebuilt enough of what had collapsed to look her in the eye again. She worked hard. She graduated, joined a mid-sized firm, spent 3 years learning the parts of the job that schools don't teach, and then applied, on the quiet advice of a colleague, to Harrington and Associates. The firm was large by Canadian standards. 140 people, projects across the country. When Stella joined the interior integration team, she spent the first 2 weeks learning names and trying not to seem as lost as she felt. Her colleague Harper, a dry and funny woman who had been at Harrington for 4 years, took her for coffee on the 3rd day and gave her the unofficial orientation. Who to trust with what, which meetings were actually optional, and the fact that the firm had just brought on a new senior partner who had reorganized 3 departments in his first month and was either brilliant or exhausting, depending on which team you were on. "What's his name?" Stella asked. "Kieran Ashby," Harper said. "You know him?" The name landed like a door being opened in a house she thought she'd locked. "No," she said, "just asking." She managed to avoid the senior partner level for nearly 3 weeks. Long enough to convince herself it might not be the same person. Long enough to construct a version of events in which this was a coincidence of names, and she was not the kind of woman who spent years half waiting for someone who had left without a phone number. Then he walked into a project briefing she had not known he would be attending, and all of it came apart. He looked exactly the same in the ways that mattered. The same stillness, the same quality of attention. He shook hands around the table, and when he reached her, he said, "Stella Baird, integration team, right?" With the mild, interested tone of someone reading a seating chart. She said yes. She kept her voice level. She looked at her notes for the rest of the briefing. Over the following weeks, she cataloged the things that did not add up. He had assigned her specifically to the Whitmore project, a complex heritage conversion that was the most interesting piece of work the firm had taken on in years, despite the fact that she was newer than several other integration leads who could have taken it. He knew she drank her coffee with 1 sugar and no milk. He had never seen her make it. He remembered the details of her project notes from one meeting to the next, with a fidelity that didn't match someone who was merely conscientious. And on the corner of his desk, beside his monitor, sat a battered field notebook with a cover she recognized. She had bought the exact same model at a second-hand shop in East Vancouver when she was 15 years old. She had written his name inside the front cover in blue pen, because she had been 15 and had not known how to give a gift without signing it like a school assignment. She told herself it was probably a different notebook. She did not actually believe that. The person who made things actively worse was Roxanne. Roxanne had been at Harrington for 6 years and had, Harper explained with careful neutrality, expected to be considered for the senior partner position that Kieran had ultimately been brought in to fill. She was skilled and she had developed, in response to the situation, a specific hostility that she distributed unevenly, mostly toward anyone she perceived as receiving attention she felt she was owed. Stella had not done anything to attract this. It happened anyway. Small things at first. Documents not forwarded, meeting invitations omitted, comments in team settings with a particular edge. Stella did not make a scene of it. She was not the type. She understood, having watched her mother navigate worse, that some situations require patient evidence rather than confrontation. The evidence arrived at the company's winter retreat in Muskoka. The retreat was 3 days at a rented lodge on a lake, the kind of team-building exercise Stella found equal parts useful and exhausting. She kept to her lane, attended the sessions that mattered, and spent the evenings grateful for Harper's company at the fire pit. On the second night there was a dinner, and Roxanne appeared at Stella's shoulder during cocktail hour with the particular warmth of someone performing friendliness in front of witnesses. "Let me get you a drink," she said. "We haven't really had a chance to talk properly." Stella accepted. She was trying to extend good faith. 20 minutes later, the edges of the room began to blur. She knew something was wrong before she could name it. A heat behind her eyes, a looseness in her limbs that didn't match 2 glasses of wine. She found Harper and said, quietly, that she wasn't feeling well. Harper looked at her and said, "Stella, your face is completely flushed. We need to get you out of here." She made it to the hallway. The numbers on the room doors were swimming. She leaned against the wall and tried to remember which room was hers. Stella. She looked up. Kieran was standing a few feet away, still in his dinner jacket, watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face in this life. The same sharp attention he used to turn on her when she was about to make an error with a compass bearing, and he was deciding whether to intervene. "Something's wrong," she said. Her voice came out clearer than she expected. "I know," he said. "I saw." He got her to her room. She remembered the lamp, being helped to sit down. She remembered his voice, low and very even, telling her she was going to be all right. She held on to that and let everything else go blurry. In the morning, she woke up on top of the covers with a glass of water on the nightstand. Kieran was asleep in the armchair by the window, with his jacket over his shoulders. She sat up carefully. Her head ached. The room was gray with early light. He opened his eyes. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "How are you feeling?" As she paused, "You stayed." Someone had to. She looked at the water glass. She looked at the window. She had been waiting 8 years for a conversation she hadn't known how to start, and she was tired of waiting. "You know who I am," she said. It wasn't a question. He was quiet for long enough that she understood it was true. "You knew when I interviewed," she said. He looked out the window. "Yes. And you decided to pretend you didn't." "I decided to give you a chance to choose," he said, without any weight from the past. "That's not your decision to make." "No," he said. "It wasn't." She waited. He leaned forward in the armchair, elbows on his knees, and told her what she hadn't known. His father, she learned, had been the business partner. The one who had borrowed George's money and not returned it. The one whose choices had sent her father into 2 jobs, and her mother into depression, and Stella herself to East Vancouver at 13 years old to live with her grandparents. He hadn't known this when he arrived in Vancouver. He'd learned it later, during that last August, going through his father's papers in Halifax while his sister recovered from surgery. Documents that made clear, in the flat language of contracts and account statements, exactly what his father had done to a small contracting business in Coquitlam. He had sat in his father's study for a long time. And then he had stayed in Halifax, because he could not think of a way to go back to East Vancouver and face a 14-year-old girl whose family his father had helped destroy, and tell her that the summer she'd just had was built, at least partly, on the proceeds of that destruction. "I was a coward," he said without dressing it up. "I was 22 and I didn't know what to do and I made the wrong choice." He'd spent the years since building the kind of career that put him in a position to do something more than apologize. He had quietly, through a lawyer, arranged for restitution to her father's old business account. Stella hadn't known. He had never intended her to know, had intended it to simply exist as something he owed. And then her application had come across his desk at Harrington. "I read your portfolio for an hour," he said, "and I thought maybe I had been wrong about what you'd want to know." She sat with all of this. It was a lot to sit with. She thought about her mother, finally well, running a community garden in Coquitlam, with the cheerful stubbornness of someone who has decided to grow things. She thought about her father, grayer now but steady, who had rebuilt slowly and without bitterness. She thought about being 15 and handing a field notebook to a young man from Halifax, who had laughed at her for spending her allowance on him. She thought about the fact that she had walked into a company gala with a sketchbook and a note and 8 years of words, and he had shaken her hand and said her name like she was anyone. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes. Years ago. Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back without flinching, which was the thing about Kieran that had always been true. He did not look away from the things he had gotten wrong. "Roxanne put something in my drink," she said. "I know, I have it on record. She'll be dealt with today." Stella nodded. She picked up the water glass and drank half of it. Outside the window, the lake was beginning to catch the light. "I need time," she said, "to think about the rest of it." "Of course. But I want you to know." She stopped. She was not, she realized, afraid of this anymore. She had been afraid of it for 8 years, because she hadn't understood what she was actually afraid of. She thought she was afraid of the answer. She understood now that the thing she had really been afraid of was the asking. The act of wanting something specific from someone specific, with no guarantee of how it went. She was 30 years old. She had survived enough to know that fear of asking was not a reason to stop. "I want you to know," she said again, "that none of what your father did changes what that year was. For me, it was still what it was. He didn't say anything, but something in his face changed in the way that faces change when a person has been holding a very specific kind of tension for a very long time and it finally releases. Roxanne resigned that same morning, before she could be asked to leave. Harper texted Stella a series of messages throughout the day that managed to be simultaneously sympathetic and deeply satisfying. The weeks that followed were quieter than Stella had expected. She went back to the Whitmore project. She had difficult days and easy ones. She had several conversations with Kieran that were strictly professional and several that were not. And she was honest in both kinds about where she stood. What she noticed, slowly, was that he had always been paying attention. Not in the way of someone performing effort, but in the way of someone who had not stopped caring and had simply not known what to do with it. It was a Tuesday evening in early spring, late enough that the office had emptied out, when he appeared at her desk with his coat on and said, "Come for a walk." She recognized the phrasing. She had heard it once before, on a back step in East Vancouver, when she had been 15 and close to crying and hadn't wanted to explain why. She got her coat. They walked down to the waterfront. The lake was restless with April wind, and the city lights were doing their usual excessive best across the water. They found a bench at the end of a pier that jutted out past the main walkway, the kind of bench that looks like a mistake in the design, but turns out to be the best seat available. She looked out at the water. He looked at her and then out at the water too. "I still have the notebook," he said. "I know. I've had it since I was 22. I've filled up 11 others since then." She turned to look at him. He reached into his coat pocket. He held out something small, a ring, plain and considered, the kind of thing chose as someone who had been thinking about it for a while. "I know there are things we haven't fully resolved," he said. "I know you have every reason to need more time. But I also know," he looked at her directly, "I have known since I was 22 years old that I did not want to stop being in your life. I made a mistake by letting that happen. I don't want to make the same one twice." The wind came off the lake. Somewhere across the water, a boat horn sounded low and far away. Stella looked at the ring. She looked at his face, older, steadier, still carrying that particular quality of attention that had once made a 13-year-old girl start taking school seriously because she wanted to earn the approval of someone who didn't give it out easily. She had been fine for 8 years. She was, she thought, ready to be more than fine. "Ask me properly," she said. He asked her properly. She said yes. They sat on the pier for a long time afterward, until the wind picked up enough that her ears ached, and his collar was turned up against it. And they walked back through the city talking in the unhurried way of two people who have just agreed that they have all the time they need. She thought about her grandmother's backyard, the cedar hedge, the pale blue siding. She thought about Pacific Spirit Park in the rain, and the way a compass bearing feels when you finally learn to trust it. How it is not the direction that was hard to find, but the confidence to believe the instrument is telling you the truth. Some things take a long time to come back to. That doesn't mean they were lost.